Hello everyone! This is my final project, a video essay for my Chinese science fiction class. As you may have picked up on in class, I have been very invested in the commonality of women and gender being vital mechanisms for allegory or theme in the stories we've read over the semester. For my final project, I have attempted to tackle the following questions. What is science fiction realism, and what connection might it have to recurring uses of the female form as vessels for social commentary? So, like most forms of literature, much of what we have read this semester within the realm of Chinese science fiction has been entwined with some form of social commentary. The story that first comes to mind is Invisible Planets by Hao Jinfang. I hope I said that right. The story entails an older mentor-like figure that's regaling a younger person with tales of different planets, each one different from the other, and all entailing some sort of concept or difficulty to ponder, many of which could be interpreted as social forms of social commentary, in my opinion. At least that's how I read it. Our class discussion about the planet Pingjiwu was full of full of easygoing people and covered in valuable resources that many places wanted to conquer and rule over and kind of have a monopoly on. It was pretty interesting to me because I was shocked by how many people were not only surprised that teachers and missionaries were mentioned to be among the first to try and conquer that planet, but they were the very first in the list in that passage. This confusion was particularly of interest to me because I found that it spoke volumes about how infrequently we think about individuals within these social roles as harboring potential for bad, when they were among the first, one, traveling and exploring, and two, inciting violence against indigenous peoples for labor or assimilation purposes, or both. However, I'm glad the conversation was had and that the individuals were written in the order they were, because, as previously stated, an important function of literature is social commentary. And I think it was a great means for what I recall to be a great discussion, so. Zhang Wenguang was one of the first authors to bring popular focus to this idea/genre of science fiction realism. Reviewers of his career unanimously regarded his exploration and promotion of science fiction realism as one of his most important contributions. Zhenyu Jiang explains in the article Contributions and Misunderstandings, Zhang Wenguang and Science Fiction Realism, that Zhang believed science fiction realism could not only do the work noted in science fiction of actually representing social reality and reflecting real lives via the design of scientific fantasy, which had long been in progress, but also was especially suitable for expressing our people's revolutionary idealism. Science fiction is a genre that has evolved to be symbolic of the complex realities and issues in China and their progress forward. Zhen Yu supplies that the basic ideas authors utilizing science fiction realism are trying to convey have also become important resources for the development of practices in China concerning social reality. In Estranging Realism in Chinese Science Fiction, Hybridity and Environmentalism in Chen Qiaofan's The Waste Tide, Kara Healy provides a translated quote from Chen Qiaofan about his storytelling and style, which reads as follows. I hope my writing has painted a picture of the future, both enormously complex and finely delicate, filled with a sense of reality and details, sometimes even to the point of being overly complicated. I have tried to balance background information and narrative to convey my belief in the aesthetic style of science fiction realism. It can be coarse, filthy, and gloomy, but also delicate, magnificent, and brilliant, like a funhouse mirror. It reflects real light in a way that is even more dazzling to the eyes. This really showcases science fiction realism as a purposely intricate and intense style, the same way that China is seen with its many intricacies. In the cynicized post-human future reimagining cyberpunk and the cyborg in Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide, Patarapong Kong Watana posits that Chen Qiufan sets science fiction apart from traditional realism and traditional science fiction through a, quote, vermistilitude that requires logical imagination and cognition in the narrative to reflect problems in societies. Chen Qiufan utilizes his hometown Guiyu to mirror China's reality, as the island has been mainly affected by globalization. So the masses of trash and waste that have become industrialized in the Waste Tide, Silicon Island, is based off a very real place in China, facing very similar environmental and social issues. This mirroring of reality allows for the use of science fiction to create a fictional setting in which the problem has been exacerbated to the point where something must be done. In the case of the Waste Tide, the realistic environmental problems and oppression of workers must be addressed. The situation is complex, messy, and leaves the reader questioning if there can ever be a solution. And in some ways, there isn't. I Decided to Divorce My Robot Wife by Wei Yahua was one of the short stories we read this semester, and it's set in a future in which, to combat overpopulation, some men are not allowed to marry and have children with human women, so robot wives have been created to marry them instead, and are supposedly perfect for their future husbands. The narrator goes from being enamored to frustrated and abusive toward his robot wife Lily, and eventually believes the de facto obedience, which he claims to be a mental deficiency later she was programmed to have for him, has ruined his life and becomes determined to divorce her. And when this fails, he seeks to educate and enlighten her. However, once she has the agency to think and do as she pleases, she divorces him over the abuse he has put her through. And she succeeds. In Effective Labor and Technologies of Gender in Wei Xiaohua's Conjugal Happiness in the Arms of Morpheus, Virginia Cohn points out that Lily is sexualized by the active objectification of the female form while excluding its physical flaws. And how, although the narrator later retracts his belief that a perfectly obedient woman is the pinnacle of desirability, he never comes to desire or dream of an imperfect female body. Lily represents not only herself, but likely Chinese women as a whole, in that even the most beautiful and obedient of women would never be able to live up to the standards that have been placed upon them. They're so mistreated and abused. Wei Yahua provides some light at the end of the tunnel that women are capable of educating themselves and learning their worth. I mean, I personally would argue that there are flaws in this allegory, as in a sense it creates the notion that women need help in the process of becoming more intelligent through men specifically, and that the expectation of beauty, it's still placing societal pressure on the enlightened woman. However, overall, it seems to be a step in the right direction. An attempt to represent that society in China has been advancing more in terms of social justice and rights to education and independence for women. Literary evidence of national progress. As Kara Healy points out in her novel Gender and Genre in Contemporary Chinese Science Fiction, reimagining pre-modern tropes in Hao Jianfeng's Folding Beijing, and Jia's 100 Ghosts Parade Tonight, there is a long history of Chinese male writers deploying female characters as, quote, vessels for the male psyche to voice personal and political critiques, hopes, and fears. This is continually relevant as the scholarly reading of female characters and gendered violence in science fiction by such male authors as Liu Zhijin, Cheng Qiufan, and Han Song as metaphors for social ills is a continuing literary tradition in contemporary Chinese fiction. In another work, Estranging Realism in Chinese Science Fiction, Hybridity and Environmentalism in Chen Qiufan's The Waste Tide, Healy uses Chen's The Waste Tide to exemplify the use of the female body as a tool for social commentary. She notes the waste tide reinterprets this resonance between female body and landscape through an environmentalist lens by equating gendered bodily suffering with the destruction of land. Both Mimi and Guiyu are transformed by the encroachment of the artificial into the natural. The incursion of e-waste has already ravaged both female body and landscape. By protecting anxieties about e-waste recycling, or more generally, global capitalism, onto Mimi's female body, The Waste Tide builds on modern Chinese literature's familiar technique of using women's bodies as a site for social critique. The catalyst of Mimi becoming this powerful techno-religious person that we see in this second half of the novel, well, last 2/3 of the novel really, is her being sexually assaulted. That's the catalyst. That's what moves her forward into this evolved self, I guess you could say. As Healy notes, the violence against Mimi's gendered body echoes the violence committed by the locals toward the migrant workers, by transactional corporations against the Chinese people, and by the waste processing industry against Guiyu's natural environment. Mimi being assaulted also connects her suffering to Chinese literature's conventional use of women suffering as commentary for the backward state of the nation. Another scholar, Padaarapong Kangwana, in the article The Cynicized Post-Human Future, Reimagining Cyberpunk and the Cyborg and Chen Qiufan's The Waste Tide, notes the use of Mimi's initial innocence to being a victim of slow violence and oppression contributes to the narrative of China's social progression, and that despite efforts, the problems in Chinese society are not easily resolved. So this relates back to Chen Qiufan's use of science fiction realism in that the complex issues and realities of China must be depicted in complex ways, but nonetheless, progress is being made. There is movements forward. Since concluding this research, I have found that the metaphor of the female form is a common literary trope within Chinese literature as a whole, but is especially prominent in the subgenre of science fiction realism because of the association between a woman and the state of the nation, and the way that science fiction realism requires a notion of progress within the complex social commentary.